Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the ABCs of Sports Nutrition, where we will be talking about everything to do with hydration and answering the question, do you need a drink? Today, I am joined with two awesome guests, Corinne Malcolm and Erin Huck. Thank you, ladies, for joining me today. I am Roxanne Vogel, the Nutrition and Performance Research Manager at GU Energy Labs, and I am just so excited to talk about everything hydration. But first, about our guests. Corinne is a professional ultra runner, coach, and science writer based out of San Francisco, California. She specializes in mountainous 100-mile races and has racked up over 10 podium and top 10 finishes at races such as Western States, Leadville 100, and UTMB's TDS. She's also getting ready to attempt a supported FKT, or fastest known time, on the Tahoe Rim Trail, which is a daunting 172-mile loop around Lake Tahoe. She is a self-proclaimed ultra nerd who spends most of her time not on the trails trying to break down the science for, not on the trails, but trying to break down the science for athletes and the general public. During this pandemic, she's acquired a new coworker, Petey, her 7-month-old puppy, who made the long haul over from Taiwan and didn't have to quarantine. We are also joined by Erin Huck, who is an elite cross-country mountain bike racer based out of Boulder, Colorado. While her race focus is on the World Cup cross-country and short track cycle events, she enjoys racing a variety of events from 100 miles to lift-served enduros. She is a 4-time national champion, a Pan American champion, and a 2016 and 2020 Olympic long team nominee. Her current goal is qualifying for the Tokyo 2020/2021 Olympics. And when not riding, she works as a program manager for a medical device company and enjoys hanging out with her partner, Andrew, and their 2-year-old Vizsla puppy, Callie.
Yeah.
All right, ladies, first of all, I want to ask you, what is your favorite GU hydration product of choice? Corinne.
I really love the Summit Tea Roctane. A lot of the runs and races I do are either in extreme weather or at high altitude. And so I oftentimes, I go to liquid. Liquid calories can be my best friends oftentimes. So it's a safe way for me to get in both the hydration I need, but also the calories I need as well.
Yes, I love Summit Tea as well because you can drink it hot or cold. And Erin, what about you?
So when I'm not racing, I also enjoy a glass of wine. And so the joke is that I really like my grape drink. So I would have to say that the grape flavor of Roctane is my go-to for like race nutrition, but I also rely on the tabs that I have with me right now that I probably drink at least every day, whether I'm training or not. So I have 2 favorites.
Excellent. And as a reminder to all of our viewers, these episodes are brought to you by Jackrabbit. And if you are looking to place a GU order on their website, jackrabbit.com, you get 25% off by using the code FUEL25. And for any of you that have questions, please feel free to go ahead and chat them to us as this is live, and we'll be attempting our best to get to all of your questions, but keep them coming, the more the merrier. So to start off, I wanted to talk about what does it mean to be hydrated? And a lot of people define it in different ways. Merriam-Webster says it's the condition of having adequate fluids in the body tissues. That's pretty general. Some people define it as being less than 2% of your body weight decreased from normal levels. So the 2% rule is another popular way to look at it. And then some other people, some folks in the Army, approach it by answering the questions about weight, whether there's 2% difference, thirst, are you thirsty or not, and urine color. But to start off, I had a little short slideshow to share with all of you, and then we will go into a larger conversation. But to begin with, So your body is made up of 60% water, which obviously is a majority. And your sweat rate can vary widely depending on both your individual characteristics and also environmental conditions. As I'm sure Erin and Corinne can attest to, it can be, one way in a cold environment and completely another in a hot or hot humid versus hot dry environment. And most athletes sweat anywhere from a half a liter to up to 3 liters or more per hour. So it's a huge range. Body water is really important for regulating not only heat removal, so how you maintain your body core temperature, but also for your heart function and delivering oxygen and other metabolites to your muscles while they're working. It's important for performance, but it's also important for health and safety. So what is in your sweat? Most people realize that sweat is largely made up of water, but it also contains electrolytes, such as sodium, magnesium, calcium, and potassium, with sodium being the largest component by far. So what's the big deal with being dehydrated, you might ask? Well, it actually makes you slower. And so in this study that you can see on the screen, they were looking at the performance and the speed of runners as they got dehydrated over time. And it showed that the further they ran and the more dehydrated they were, the slower their performance was. And so whereas at short distances, maybe a half mile to a mile, their speed might only decrease by, say, 3%. As they ran further, their speed decreased even more, so 6% or more slower than if they were hydrated. And again, a good way to find out if you are potentially dehydrated is to consider 3 variables. So weight, thirst, and urine color. Is your body weight less or more than 2% reduced from what it should normally be? Are you thirsty? And is your urine color dark? If you answer yes to any of those, you get a point. And if you are 2 points or higher, then you are probably dehydrated. Well, what color should your pee be, you might ask? As you can see from this picture here, you want it to be in the light clear or light yellow to yellow range, whereas the darker colors indicate dehydration. And then when you're exercising in the heat, it might be even harder to stay hydrated because you're sweating more and it's harder for your body to dissipate heat depending on the humidity. So the more humid it is, the harder it is for that sweat to evaporate and to release heat from your body. But it's also hard to stay hydrated in cold environments and at altitude. So you actually lose more water at altitude because the air is drier. And you perhaps maybe don't want to drink as much when it's cold outside. Furthermore, you might be more at risk to cold injuries if you are dehydrated because less blood flow is going to your extremities, such as your fingers and toes. I know from personal experience, I've had frostbite on my toes. So it's important to remember that even when it's cold and you don't feel like drinking, find a way to stay hydrated. Sometimes that means drinking hot beverages. A little bit about how much hydration. So before, say, you go exercise or have an event or a race, try to drink about half your body weight in ounces. So if you're 160 pounds, then 80 ounces would be a good target for a daily intake leading up to an event. And then before, so say the morning of, try to drink 1/10 your body weight in ounces. Again, with a 160-pound person example, that would be about 16 ounces. And you'd want to finish this probably at least an hour before your race time, just so you have time to let go of any extra fluids. And this can be water or a sports drink or some kind of electrolyte drink so that you get some of the important electrolytes there as well. During your event, you want to have a plan and adjust based on local conditions and environmental considerations. Electrolytes and carbohydrates may be warranted depending on the duration and intensity of your activity. And a good rule of thumb or place to start is to try and get about 16 ounces or 500 milliliters per hour. Afterwards, depending on how much weight you lost during exercise, try to replenish with 24 ounces for every pound of weight lost. Include sodium in your replenishment strategy and protein and carbs for recovery. To sum up our small lesson here, hydration helps you perform your best. Dehydration can really negatively impact your performance, also your mood and focus. Electrolytes help you hold on to your hydration, and it's important to have a plan and practice that plan. So, ladies, question for you all. Tell me about a time, Erin, I'm going to pick on you, that you had a hydration fail, and what did you learn from it, and how have you gotten past that?
Well, I think I've had failures on both end of the spectrum. So something that you didn't mention is the hyponatremia. I don't know how to say it, but
Yep.
I think I've experienced that on more than one occasion. And that is basically where I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have too much water to electrolyte balance. So your body is out of balance essentially. So in my case, I live in Colorado. I'm not used to heat as much, especially in the spring. And then going to sea level and like, um, the moist air, etc. So my body definitely takes a while to adapt to that kind of race condition. And I think that there have been a few occasions where I drank too much just plain water. And when I finished the race, I threw up a bunch and got really bad headaches. And to me, that was a sign that I didn't quite have the electrolyte balance dialed. So that's one example on one end of the spectrum. And then the other end of the spectrum of not drinking enough is still a pretty regular occurrence because, being in a mountain bike race, sometimes I'll forget to grab a bottle or I'll miss like a bottle feed and then you don't get quite enough water. And for me, the first indications of that are kind of like goosebumps. My body's not able to regulate the temperature quite as much. And I'll just be really careful to kind of down regulate my effort until I can get more water, and then just make sure that whatever I'm drinking has a high enough electrolyte balance to kind of offset the sweat that I am that's pouring off my body.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points. And Corinne, I also was going to pick your brain a little bit. I know that you have also studied exercise physiology and environmental physiology as well. So can you tell us a little bit from your knowledge bank, what happens when you get dehydrated?
Yeah, so kind of we can piggyback off of what Erin said as well, with dehydration or hyponatremia. So either hyperhydrated or hypo, so underhydrated, right, would be the kind of what we're looking at there. And they both have, those negative consequences. And the tricky thing is there too, they have very similar negative consequences as far as how you feel. So treating it appropriately actually can be a really dangerous element for like race medics, for example, after races, where they might not give the appropriate treatment, not knowing someone's hyponatremic and just thinking they're dehydrated. But as you mentioned in your PowerPoint slides, which I think were really excellent, one of the key things there is that our bodies contain so much water, so much liquid, both in our cells and around our cells, that when that balance is out of whack, all of a sudden you basically decrease that volume of water, right? You decrease that volume of liquid. And so your body can't get blood, for example, to where it needs to go. There's not as much of it. So you're not getting as much liquid, as much blood to your skin surface to dissipate heat. Or your example of frostbite, you're not getting as much blood flow away from your core when it's cold, or it's being shunted towards your core when it's cold, and you're not getting that blood flow to your extremities. It really can mess with your digestion, and that's where I've actually struggled the most when I mess this up. Your stomach and your small intestines are vital for both hydration and nutrition, and when that imbalance gets really out of whack, or when that balance gets out of whack and you don't have that blood plasma volume, you don't have as much liquid in your cells and around your cells, your ability to move liquid and nutrition from inside your small intestine to inside your body gets down regulated, gets shut down. Essentially, there's no blood flow to that tissue, or limited blood flow to that tissue. So you basically are creating a hypoxic environment because you're dehydrated inside your body. So there's all these little factors. When you say dehydration decreases performance, it's not just because like you might feel bad. I know I think the equivalent of hanger for when I'm dehydrated. And I'm like, I'm not a very good hydrator in my day. I feel like I do a really good job in races actually, but I'm a really bad hydrator in my day-to-day life, particularly like around long training sessions even. I'm just not as focused when I need to be. And all those, like, besides the mood and the cognitive effects of maybe being dehydrated, those downstream effects are going to affect and impair your nutrition, both on the bike, on the run, and post exercise. You're not going to be able to thermoregulate very well, and all these things just like compound and build off one another, and that's why you slow down. That's why you detonate out there. So it's all these little factors, but it's mostly related to just that total body, like liquid volume or plasma volume decreasing, and then having downstream effects from there.
Right. Yeah. And, I can think of lots of examples where I've messed up in my hydration game. And actually, not even too long ago, I was running and it was a really warm day. I was out in the mountains at elevation. So it was dry from that, but there's also a lot of smoke in this area right now because of wildfires. So just really dry, really smoky, and really hot. And I definitely ended up getting dehydrated to the point where I didn't even have to go to the bathroom for like 8 hours. And at that point, I was like, okay, we need to call this off because it's obviously dehydration setting in, and you just feel your power being sapped. Like it's like you have the will, but your muscles just don't want to go. And so that's the best way I know how to explain it. It's like your power just gets lost. But yeah, it does also impact, interestingly, your mood and your mental status, so your cognition, which a lot of people don't realize. And that's why it's so important, and a safety consideration as well, is because when you're dehydrated, you might be less apt to make good decisions. And if you're, say, in the armed services or a first responder or something like that, and you're out there on the front lines and dehydrated, then that can really affect safety as well. But let's get back to, we have a question from one of our viewers named Sarah. She says, what are some of the signs when you're running, cycling, etc., that you should supplement your water with electrolytes? So Erin, let me go to you real quick. Do you always put electrolytes in your drink? And if not, when do you consider adding, say, an electrolyte supplement capsule like we make?
So even for easy rides, I will typically put electrolytes into my drink mix. And sometimes just like the tabs, the effervescent tabs that GU sells, those are my go-to. Yep. So for an easy ride, I would always have that at least. If I'm doing any kind of intensity, then I usually use the Roctane mix that has electrolytes and calories. And sometimes I'll do both. So I'll put a tab in and I'll put the Roctane mix in. And then for like last year, I did a 4-day stage race in Israel, which was the worst, like hot, humid conditions that I've ever raced in, and it was over 4 days. So, like, that's the kind of situation where any dehydration would be cumulative because you can't really catch up after you're dehydrated. So I used all three. So I had the tabs, I had the Roctane mix, and I put in the capsules, one per bottle, and I would just open them up and dump them out and mix them into my bottle. And then even in my Camelback, I just put one of the hydration tabs. So that was a great thing to have on my back, as well as, have the calories in my bottle on my bike. So I almost always have some kind of electrolyte in my drink mix.
Right, right. And then Corinne, I know you coach several athletes. Do you have general guidelines? I know we have some here at GU, which I'll go over in a minute, but do you have general guidelines for your athletes, or do you do any sort of sweat testing with them?
So I do have athletes that do get sweat tested, particularly if we've found a bunch of problems on the run or in a race where they're chronically having some sort of issue, or they've noticed, they finish runs and they're just crusted in salt or something. Then, we'll evaluate that. The thing is that there's a huge range of sweat, right? Like you mentioned how much you might sweat just in liters of sweat per hour, but then that's further compounded by how concentrated your sweat is. And people sweat something like, I think the low end is like 400 milligrams per liter or 300 milligrams per liter of sweat, all the way up to 1,500 milligrams. So sweaty, like so salty per liter. And so when it comes to hydration, it becomes a little bit complicated because you're balancing how sweaty you are, so how much volume of sweat you're losing per hour, which is different, even within the individual. Like when I'm super heat acclimated, my sweat rate's going to change versus earlier in the season, for example. And then on top of that, you have that concentration. So how much salts essentially am I losing in my sweat per liter that's coming out? And so that's super individual. And so it's hard to give, that's why we have big ranges, right? That's why there's always these recommendations, and it's a pretty big range. Same with 16 to 32 ounces of fluid an hour. That's a pretty big range.
Right.
And so what I always recommend to my athletes is that we spend our early season stuff starting to experiment with their hydration and their nutrition, utilizing their longer workouts to make sure that we're dialing in what we think their needs are, and then recommending testing for people if they're going to, if we're having problems, essentially. If we can't figure it out in that experimentation, you can go in and you can get there, depending on where you live, people have sweat testing available to them, particularly around metropolitan or university settings.
Right. And then out of curiosity, have you ever done just the generic kind of, or Erin, I think we've even maybe talked about this before, sweat testing where you weigh yourself before and you weigh yourself after exercise and you determine how much you've lost, right? Didn't we do that with you?
Yeah. I think it was after one of those really bad races where what just happened? And it's so hard to know, especially if you don't know. I'm not a physiologist, so I don't know, but sometimes you feel like you're bonked from not having enough calories when actually you're bonked from being dehydrated, and it's really hard to tell the difference. So that was one of those, I thought I just wasn't eating enough, but it turns out I wasn't drinking enough.
Yeah. It can be hard to tell the difference sometimes when it's just your energy levels are gone, whether it's fluids or feeding. We did have another question come through, and one of our viewers, John, says that he stays pretty hydrated through the day. And usually when he goes to run or ride outside for shorter distances, say an hour or less, he doesn't take water with him. And he wants to know, what's our perspective for people doing shorter activities and hydration? And I mean, I would go ahead and say that for activities that are less than an hour, unless it's extremely hot and humid out there, you'd probably be okay to just make sure you're plenty hydrated before, maybe throw in an electrolyte tab ahead of time, just so you have some extra electrolytes on board. Ladies, do either of you have any input on that?
I'd agree with that. I think that's my recommendation to my athletes generally for both on a nutrition or hydration front, is that if it's under an hour, it's, unless we're really worried about the heat index for safety reasons, I think it's fine not to be carrying anything. But going into the workout, as you mentioned, you hydrated. So a stable hydration, as opposed to going in, maybe you've worked 8 hours and you didn't do a good job. Unlike this guy didn't do a good job hydrating, maybe that means you need to take something with you. But if you are hydrated adequately throughout the day, that's probably not an issue at all.
Right. And then going back to a minute ago when we were talking about sodium intake levels and what kind of general guidelines are, I know that from our product standpoint, we generally recommend an intake of 300 to 800 milligrams per hour. And we do make a range of products that can help meet those needs, anywhere from, say, our Roctane energy drink mix, which has 320 milligrams per serving. So if you drank one bottle of this per hour, you'd at least be hitting your minimum targets, right? So 300 milligrams. And then we also have our capsules, which Erin actually opens up and dumps into her water, or you can take just a capsule and swallow it with some water. But each one of these has 140 milligrams. So, depending on what the conditions are and, how much of a sweaty athlete you are, how much of a salty sweater you might be, you can really tailor your needs based on just the products themselves, but also the addition of additional electrolytes. So going back here for a minute, I know, Corinne, you did touch on general intake guidelines for fluid intake, and we would agree that 16 to 32 ounces or a half liter to a full liter per hour is kind of a good ballpark place to start for most folks, and they can tailor based on how they feel. But what do you do during a race? Is that always realistic? And I wanted to find out from you both, how do you carry your fluids so that you can meet these targets? Because that's a whole nother concern is, you have these goals and say during a long race, you need to carry 4 liters of fluid, but is that realistic? So how do you approach your race hydration strategy? I'll start with Erin.
So it depends on the race, but like for the World Cup style racing, we typically do laps of about 5K each lap. And so that takes anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. So I can just carry a bottle on my bike and then get a new bottle when I go through the feed zone. So that's typically what I'll do for that style of racing. For the longer races, if I'll just carry it on my back, either with extra bottles on my back or a camelback type thing with up to 3 liters of extra fluid. And sometimes even for more technical riding, that's helpful because it's a lot easier to just, get your hose and drink, and you can keep your hands on the handlebar versus having to fumble with a water bottle. So I kind of, cater my nutrition carrying based on the event.
Makes sense. Very logical. Corinne, what about you?
Yeah, very similar. Although I have use of my hands most of the time, which is nice. But it's different when I race in Europe and I race really, really mountainous races. I come from a ski background, so I rely on poles pretty heavily. And so where in the US I might have like always have access to my hands to drink from a soft flask or a hand bottle. When I'm racing with poles, I have to like remind myself to drink because I have something else in my hands instead, which took a little bit of adjusting to, I feel like, when I realized I wasn't drinking as much, particularly on the climbs. But generally speaking, most of my races, depending on the distance, the aid stations, I feel like we get catered to a little bit, right? We've got aid stations spaced out anywhere from 4 to, I think the longest gap I've had in a race is like 16 miles between aid. And those longer stretches you have to plan for. I have to plan for them for my racing. I have to help my athletes plan for them in their racing because I might only need a liter between aids that are, it's early in the day, it's not as hot, versus, a long, long stretch in the middle of the day. So actually for one of the races I was prepping for in Europe this year, I knew that the aid stations were super far apart. And so my strategy was going to be to carry one of my soft flasks was going to be a filter bottle because there's plenty of natural water on the course, even though the aid stations are super far apart. And so I was going to utilize like filling up either a bladder, actually, which I haven't raced with in such a long time, or both my bottles at aid stations, but I'd have this filter bottle along the way to be able to dip creeks. And they've got all these fountains along the course and that kind of stuff where you can, acquire water as opposed to relying on the aid. So that's been the main strategy there. I do find that I noticed recently on a long run is that I had to rely on water availability. It was a long 40-mile self-supported effort. And I definitely was pushing like the not being so practical, not wanting to carry as much water, but then realizing that like my next water source was like 15 miles away. So like having to load up, like having an extra bottle that I could tuck water into and put it in my pack so that I wouldn't go dry and then not be able to eat and all the associated, downstream terribleness that would come with it.
Right. And then, another question kind of related is there are a couple of different camps when it comes to, having a plan for your hydration during events versus drinking to thirst. And there really is kind of this tension in the scientific community over this concept of drinking to thirst versus, planned intake. And I wanted to see which of those camps either of you would fall into. Erin, what do you think?
I think so for me in mountain bike races, sometimes you can only drink at certain sections of a course. So like you can't drink on the downhills necessarily. Like you have to drink when you are able to physically, like being able to control your bike and stuff. So that kind of dictates where I stand on it because I might not be thirsty, but it's the only chance I'm going to have to drink. So I'm going to drink when I can. So that's kind of, I think, just how it works out for me. I don't have the luxury per se of drinking to thirst because you can't time that perfectly. So I kind of get used to like physical reminders that it's time to drink. So, and try and stay on top of it that way.
And would you, for instance, like look at a course profile, say elevation changes and things like that, and plan that way? Is that how you would do it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like when we're pre-riding a course, that's definitely something that we think about. Like, okay, here's where I need to drink because I won't have another opportunity, for the rest of the lap, and that's 10 minutes. And then if you miss that opportunity, then you're going 30 minutes without drinking. So, yeah, that's definitely something that we plan out.
Right. And then what about you, Corinne? Do you drink to a plan or do you drink to thirst?
I feel like I'm in an in-between camp somewhere. There's definitely, I think science sometimes looks for black and white answers, but there's definitely a lot of shades of gray in there. Like there are definitely instances in like trail and ultra running that are to Erin's point where you might not be able to drink in certain sections because you need to focus on what's happening around you. Multitasking can be very difficult. And so I think that I like to go in with an idea of like, particularly like leaving aid stations, like aware of how much I'm carrying, so that I don't like leave an aid station super short. Like what's the maximum I could need to bring with me, and then kind of just listening to my body from there. If I'm in a bad mood, I'm like, I'm probably hungry or thirsty, so I should probably work on those things. I've definitely had that happen in a race where I'm like, I'm feeling down on myself. It's time to have a snack. And I think hydration goes right along with that. But I will, like, if I'm coming into an aid station and I've got, or I know I'm approaching an aid station and I know that that's going to be my opportunity to fill up. Although I'm generally trying to like trickle in hydration and not take in, 12 ounces at a time or something really quickly. I will like finish a soft flask because I know I'm about to fill it up. And I kind of use that as like that mile or two to be like, you're going to finish this now because like you're going to want to fill it up when you get there.
And yeah, that actually brings up a question we had from one of our members of the audience who said, is there any difference in effectiveness or the benefits of drinking a little fluid every 10 to 15 minutes versus drinking a lot at once? And what does your body, or how does your body absorb it best? So you did kind of touch on it, and that's the way I would approach it as well, is sort of like a IV trickle or, like a sip type approach where you're trying to take in a little bit of fluid, say every 15 minutes or so. And there is some recent evidence that suggests that drinking every 20 minutes is actually better than drinking every 5 minutes. So it kind of can go both ways. But I would say from what I know and what I've seen in the research that probably drinking anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes is a pretty good approach. What do you guys think? Erin, what do you try to do?
It depends. Like will try and get like a pretty substantial amount of fluid in when I drink. So I would say like maybe 6 ounces would be like if I'm equating it to like a standard bike size water bottle, that's 20 ounces, I think. And I would try and get in about a fourth of that when I'm making the effort to drink. So and then maybe twice per lap. So do that twice per 20 minutes is probably my goal. Sometimes it's only once per 20 minutes, but it's still like that 4 to 5 ounce. So I don't know where that falls into, if that's considered a sip or it's probably a gulp.
Yeah, it's like a gulp.
Yeah.
It's not a chug.
Yeah, it's not a chug. It's like a gulp.
Corinne, what do you do with your athletes? What do you suggest to them?
Yeah, so I think we're kind of all in agreement there where we're talking like, trickling it in and, maybe like these sips to gulps. I don't think you need to be constantly drinking kind of mindlessly. But then we can always tie everything into nutrition as well. Like when I take in solids, like maybe I have just water or I've got a low calorie but electrolyte drink in my bottle. I'm going to be using that drink to take in with my solids. And for me, like I do kind of follow, unless I'm like getting hangry, I like follow, I'm eating every 30-ish minutes, depending on the race. And that's a time where I'm going to take in probably more akin to what, that gulp, 4 to 6 ounces of fluid when I'm trying to get that gel down or the bar or chews or whatever it is. And then naturally probably going to drink a little bit between then and the next time I eat. So it probably breaks down into that every 15-minute window all of a sudden, so that I'm not constantly drinking because it's not readily available to me unless I'm running with a hydration bladder. And then utilizing that drink, either water or electrolytes, to help bring in and like transport whatever solid food I'm taking in as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That seems like a pretty reasonable approach as well. And I think it's also something a lot of people don't realize is that when you are taking in any kind of nutrition, it's really helpful to hydrate with it because that helps you actually absorb the nutrients better. So, people take a gel and don't take water, or, eat some kind of solid, say a chew, and don't take water. And sometimes they have a little bit of digestive upset, but if you drink a little water along with it, that usually helps clear up any issues for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
We did have a question about, Corinne, maybe you can answer this. If you're already dehydrated during a long event, maybe over 30 hours, this seems right up your alley. What's the best strategy to get back on track with hydration?
Yeah, so it's hard. Like when we talk about how much we're drinking, like 16 to 32 ounces an hour as our goal, we're losing much more liquid than that, even at the least sweaty of us. Like we're never trying to keep it like that bank at completely even. So you're always going to be in a little bit of a hole. And Erin kind of mentioned this earlier about like dialing back the intensity for a little bit to try to like aid in catching up on hydration or nutrition. And I think that stands here. I think when you're racing these really long events, people think their race is over when, they get super dehydrated, or maybe they're puking, or nothing wants to go down, or you're cramping, whatever it is. Like those can feel like race ending events. But in a lot of these really long races, either racing at the front end of the race, or even, just trying to break, like make it through cutoff times. If you give yourself time to slow down, or even to like spend that 30 minutes in an aid station, but obviously that's like moving at 0 miles at like minute miles is not great, but taking that time to slow down and giving your body that time to actually be able to not compete for resources, i.e. you're like, maybe you're at altitude, maybe you're overheating, whatever it is, your body can only do so many things at once. So if you go to 0 and your body isn't trying to cool yourself off, or bring oxygen to all your muscles at once, and it can focus on bringing, oxygenated blood to your stomach, and your small intestines, that might be your best way to get back on track with hydration, as opposed to just slamming a ton of liquid. It's not fun to have to stop for a little bit, but that can definitely save a race that's going awry.
Cool. Yeah. So that's great advice. Maybe slow down a little bit and wait for your body to catch up to the pace you're trying to push. I know that some folks in some of these really long ultra endurance events, they have aid stations where they actually have like hot foods that they'll cook for you. And I know that one staple is actually like broth and soups and things like that. And so I have talked to quite a few runners who, their stomach was going south, and then really late in the game, maybe they're 20 hours or 24 hours into a race, really the only thing they could stomach at that point was some sort of broth, which is great because it has not only fluids, but also a lot of sodium. So, that could be another strategy for people who are late in the game in an ultra endurance event and maybe pretty dehydrated and having a hard time taking anything in. But it might be palatable, but it will also give you those electrolytes, which could be really beneficial. Another question we had was, is distilled water better? And I assume this means, is distilled water better than regular water? Corinne, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know the answer to that. I feel like this like harkens to the like, is bubbly water dehydrating controversy? And I'm like, I don't know. Like it's like the same like camp as like, is coffee dehydrating? Is beer dehydrating? We can get, maybe that's the hot button issue. I don't know. I feel like distilled water, right? We're talking about like water that has everything stripped from it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think getting trace minerals through normal water isn't going to like cause some competition at a cellular level. There are certain nutritional products, looking at you, hydrogels, that like water that has too much of a certain particulate matter, particularly calcium, will actually cause that product to like solidify, which is super gross. So not a goo problem, great, but there are certain nutritional products that like drink mixes that when mixed with Regular water that's too high in certain minerals will cause the product to react poorly and not dissolve in it. But outside of that, I can't think of a biochemistry side reason in the body for distilled to be better than regular water.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that I could think of would be, does it change the effectiveness of, say, if you're adding a hydration product to the water, like kind of like what you said, like if your local tap water might have more minerals or calcium or fluoride or whatever it is in it, does that change the effectiveness of your sports nutrition on top of it? So personally, I always try to do filtered water, but I'll filter it like from a tap. But that's just what I do at home in general life.
Yeah,
But
not a race practicality though thing.
yeah, I probably wouldn't like buy distilled water just for an event or something.
Yeah.
But anyways, keep the questions coming. They're enjoyable. Okay, and then let's see. I had a few kind of preloaded questions that I wanted us to think about. Does fluid temperature make a difference? And when I say difference, as far as you're wanting to drink it, but also any performance differences. So for you, Erin, does the temperature of your fluid of choice, does that make a difference in how much you want to drink it? And if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in both directions. Like if you're out on a cold bike ride, the last thing that I want to do is drink a slushy, slightly frozen water bottle. So in that instance, I'd try and keep my drinks as warm as possible. And then vice versa, like when you're in 90 plus degrees heat, the last thing I want to drink is like, tepid, slightly warm water. So if you can try and keep it cool, and I've also heard that that's a good strategy for getting your core body temperature a little bit lower, is if you can ingest something that is slightly cool, but not shockingly like brain freeze frozen, because it has caused problems for me in the past. Like when it's too cold, like I feel like it shocks your system and doesn't work out very well. So the answer is yes, temperature does matter.
Right. And Corinne, I know you've done a bit of writing about ways to deal with the heat. And I think you even talked a little bit about beverage temperature. Do you have any thoughts on, for cooling purposes, what's the best temperature to keep your beverage at?
Yeah. So as Erin mentioned, that is a big issue. And they did a lot of research on ice slurries. So this would be very cold, right? Like crushed ice liquid that you'd be ingesting. So you're ingesting ice essentially. And they found that like cold water, like so water that's like that's in your cooler, for example, or that's packed with ice around it before it's handed off to you, or even probably with like whole ice cubes in it, not a big deal. That's going to be nice and refreshing. But when it's too cold, they found that essentially your body does freak out. And that's like a good way to put it, that it tricks your body into thinking that it's colder than it is. So there's basically receptors in your body, and it registers that temperature and it freaks out. And instead of continuing to vasodilate and send blood to your skin surface, it causes the opposite. And it tries to, it thinks you're cold. So it tries to hold all the blood at your core, which isn't going to allow you to dissipate heat. So you can use it for pre-cooling pretty safely. So before your event. So I know in ultras, we don't do this as much because our races are too long to really benefit from pre-cooling. But for someone in Erin's position, they utilize pre-cooling before the start of these short, like 90-ish minute races, because you want to keep your core body temperature, like the temperature of your skin versus your core versus the environment. You want to maintain that gradient so that you've got places for the heat to go. And so someone like Erin gets to utilize pre-cooling. So that could be an icy slurry. It could be like covering your body in cold towels and ice vests, etc. But that's gonna, like, pre-cooling icy slurry is fine. During event, you want to avoid overly cold beverages because it could actually trick your body into thinking it's colder than it actually is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I've heard of definitely the ice slurries for pre-cooling, but that's interesting, the part about tricking your body into actually holding onto heat. So good tip there. We got another tip that came in while you were talking, and it comes from one of our GU mountain bike pros, Nikki Peterson, and she says to put a splash of liquor in your water during the winter to keep it from freezing. And well, that's a new one that I hadn't used before. I I do know that actually putting electrolytes in your water will help lower the freezing temperature and keeping it from freezing longer. So I do use that one, but thank you, Nikki, for the tip. Depending on your event, that could work out or not. Put that one in the bank. Yeah, so here's another question that I get a lot actually is, should I salt load before an event? So doing like large amounts of sodium in your drink, say like 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams before to try to hyperhydrate or like overhydrate and get your body to hold on to lots of water. Because one of the things that happens when you get a lot of salt in the diet, which people with hypertension are often told to, not have as much sodium in their diet, is that it actually helps you hold on to fluids more and can increase blood pressure because the blood volume is expanding. So what would you say to salt loading, Corinne? Do you find that with your athletes? Have you heard of that? Any experience with it?
So I've tried it. I've tried a hyperhydration style product where I'm trying to I think it works better in shorter events where you might not have access to a bottle. So like cyclocross, for example, where you might not have a bottle for the entirety of your race, for example. But I found that, so there's two things that happen. Just as you mentioned, you're holding on to water more, which can be really uncomfortable feeling too. Like I think we're all used to how our body moves, and it can be kind of a significant amount of weight, which is obviously going to change over the course of the event. You're going to lose, like that will be lost, but that can feel really uncomfortable on the start line, depending on the duration of your race. And it just made me feel really dry starting out. So even though pre-race, so I was hyperhydrated, I felt my mouth went dry like almost immediately. And I felt dry for like the first hour and a half of my event because I had all this like the salt content essentially, and it needed more liquid. And I didn't like that. And so I've actually avoided doing it. But I think depending on the person, like how salty a sweater you are, and the duration of your event, I know there's a ton of research on this. There's probably good cases for it, but it's not for everyone is kind of the contingency thing, I would say.
Yeah, and just hearing you talk about the extra salt in your mouth feeling dry, it just makes me think of when you eat too much like salty pretzels or something like that, and all you want to do is just drink water because there's so much sodium in your system that your body's essentially telling you to drink more to dilute it. So yeah, that's kind of the underlying mechanism, right? Is like you take in a bunch of salt and then you have to have all that water to sort of balance out your fluids. So it is an interesting approach. I can't say that I've done it personally, but some people, like what you're saying, for shorter events, it might work out where you don't have the opportunity to maybe drink as much as you would like to. Erin, have you ever done anything with hyperhydration at all?
Yeah, I have actually. And I can definitely speak to it being uncomfortable and, you're wearing like this little spandex skin suit and you're like,
So tight.
like sausage, limbs. It's like, oh, this is not really confidence inspiring. But so yeah, don't like that. But I do think that it probably helps just because sometimes it is so hard to drink, especially at the start of a race. So I think a lot of mountain bike athletes won't even start with a water bottle and try and hyperhydrate, um, and then start drinking, maybe midway or towards the end of their race. So, but again, our races are an hour and a half. So I think that like you could get by with that for like a half an hour, but after that, you want to take something in. So I've tried it. I think it works. But yeah, doesn't feel super awesome. So
Yeah, that sounds uncomfortable just hearing you talk about the little skin suit. Um, Quick point of clarification, because we've been talking a little bit about sodium, but we also kind of talk about salt almost interchangeably. Corinne, can you explain to the audience the difference between salt versus sodium?
Yeah, so it's just like the difference between table salt and sodium. So table salt is sodium chloride, NaCl, versus sodium just being Na, the elemental sodium. But we think of them interchangeably, and your body can use a variety of salts, depending on what the thing paired with sodium, like with just sodium is. So you'll see that in most products that it's paired with a couple other electrolyte elements oftentimes. Like sodium citrate, you'll see sodium chloride, like chloride, chlorine. Yep. There's a bunch of different pairings, I feel like.
Yeah, yeah. And then, a lot of times it's interesting based on what country or what region you're in, how they label it. Like in the European Union, for instance, I think they put salt on the label, which is inclusive of sodium and chloride, versus here in the States, we just put sodium. And so, if you're trying to figure out the calculation between the two, sodium is about 40% of sodium chloride. So, if you're looking at a label and it says salt content, you could times it by 40% and get the sodium level there. So I know we've had that issue with one of our newer products, the Liquid Energy, which was labeled for European sales, and it does say salt on the label on the back. And so we've made that correction. So it's 75 milligrams of sodium per serving. So, and that's another nice little way to get a boost of hydration as well, because there is more of a fluid component to this one. Have you guys tried this, by the way? Erin, have you tried the Liquid Energy?
Yeah. It's one of my, I mean, at first I was kind of shocked, like the first time I use it, because the consistency is so different than the gel. And I kind of like squirted it all over myself because it's pretty, it's not very viscous. So it is more on the water end of the spectrum. But now I love them. Because sometimes you get like I think you've talked about it before, but like the flavor fatigue. So when you're drinking your water bottle, and I always have my grape drink, sometimes I just want to drink something that isn't grape drink, and so those liquid gels are perfect little like wake up for my taste buds. But yeah, so I like them a lot, and I've even heard tips of people freezing them. I haven't tried that for like cold weather, and that could be like a really good thing to do for hot races.
Yeah, the Liquid Energy popsicle.
Mhm.
Yeah, and a way I like to describe it for people who haven't, had a chance to experience this yet is somewhere between a gel and a juice box. Like if you could think of like almost Capri Sun-ish.
Yeah.
That's kind of the texture and liquid of this. And Corinne, have you had much experience with the Liquid Energy yet?
Yeah, so I was fortunate. I lived in Canada for a little bit, so I was able. I've seen this on the market for a little bit longer, and then I was having my Canadian friends buy it for me because we couldn't get it in the States.
Yeah.
And it's honestly, there's a lot of European gels that go with more of this consistency, and they're like pretty big packages. It's like startled me at races before, but it's really nice, I think, because when I end up kind of with like gel fatigue in a race, because I've done 100-mile races where I've been able to eat gels until mile 96, for example. It's a lot of gels.
How many gels is that? Wait, how many gels is that?
It's a lot of gels.
Didn't you say once it was like 90 gels or something?
I don't think I've done that many gels, but it's a lot of gels.
I was gonna say, I think you might have the record for most gels consumed in a race.
It's a lot.
We should count one time.
It's great. Max King probably does actually, because he can take in gels like every 20 minutes, but he races shorter distances generally. But what's nice about this, I feel like, is that I start to fight not necessarily like palate fatigue, like flavor fatigue, but I fight like my mouth just doesn't want to eat anymore. And I'm actually like, because I'm breathing so hard for so long, like I've been racing for 20 hours, my throat hurts for days from that component of it. And so I find that like something like this, like a liquid solution, allows me to like not have to chew or not have to like even though gels are not like, you don't have to chew gels generally speaking, unless it's really cold out. Like it's so easy to like get down that it just like, that's a really reassuring like flavor and consistency.
Yeah, it's definitely a nice extra tool to have in the toolbox, I would say, just to mix in here or there, because I know for really long events or even self-supported events, it might not be practical to carry a bigger packet with you. But if you have a few of these and say like a bunch of gels or stroop waffles and things that are smaller, more compact, then it's just a nice way to sort of mix it up and avoid what I like to call is just like a palate fatigue or texture fatigue even, because that does happen. Like you just get tired of the same textures over time.
Oh
yeah. The one question that came through is, when would you use a Roctane drink mix over Goo Tabs? And this seems pretty straightforward. So does anyone want to volunteer to take this question? Erin? No? Corinne?
I think we both use both products. I think it depends on what you want out of your bottle. If you want calories, the easy option is Roctane. If you don't want calories, the easy option would be Goo Tabs, right? They both contain electrolytes. but Roctane is going to be a calorie bottle, potentially as like all the calories you might even need for an hour, for example. And so if you're going to go that route, like that to me is like how I like, that's the difference. If I'm taking in Roctane, it's because I'm utilizing it that hour as my calorie source, versus I'll mix in goo tabs with regular water like throughout along, like I'll alternate bottles. Like this hour it's, water with goo tabs, this hour it's Roctane, this hour it might just be plain water, because I'm focusing more on like my food having electrolytes in it, and then kind of continue to alternate it from there. But that's the difference in my mind, is like, do I need calories in my bottle or do I not need calories in my bottle?
Yeah, that's a really good way to look at it, because you look at the labels of these two products and they each have 320 milligrams of sodium. So you're like, oh, well, it's the same amount of sodium per serving, then why would I use one versus the other? And as you said, this is like your major calorie and energy source. So, if you're going long or you're going hard, I would say this is probably a good bet. And, if you're just maybe even going on something shorter, maybe you don't need as many calories, then a GU hydration tab will give you the electrolytes you need and maybe not the extra calories that you may not necessarily need. So excellent response. But let's see. Well, we're almost here at time. So ladies, was there anything else that you could think of? Tips for the newbie, perhaps? I would go one from each of you for somebody, or something you would tell yourself when you were first starting out with your training or your career that you didn't know about hydration that you've learned since then that would be helpful for somebody just starting out. Erin?
That's actually pretty tough. I think that there's a lot of tips. I think that when I was just starting out, I didn't really pay attention to hydration. Just kind of taking it for granted that, like, oh, drink when you're thirsty, or forgetting to bring bottles and not planning on having enough bottles. But it's definitely something to pay attention to, and plan just like you would your nutrition. And I also, like, I think Corinne, you mentioned this, like, I do a pretty bad job of hydrating when I'm not exercising, and I'm starting to see the impacts that has. Like, that delays your recovery. It like, if you wait too long to hydrate, then I'm getting up in the middle of the night to pee, and then my sleep quality goes down. Even your sleep quality goes down if you're dehydrated to begin with. So I would say that is probably a tip for current Erin, is to focus on, my daily hydration, not just on the bike. And then, yeah,
That's
that's
a
what I would say.
really,
Yeah.
really good point. Yeah, I think a lot of times we get so focused on events and when you're training, and we forget about just the overall daily nutrition and hydration strategies, which are the base of your pyramid, right? If your sports nutrition is the top of the pyramid, and your base is the majority of your day is spent eating and drinking just normal food. So staying hydrated, period, is just so important. What about you, Corinne?
Yeah, I think mine's kind of similar. I think that I'm in this phase right now where we're kind of transitioning out of our what would have been a race season, or like maybe like we're doing our final big events of the year. So we're all kind of getting back to basics. And I think that a lot of not maybe us, but a lot of people in general, we're looking for like shortcuts, or we're like, we're gonna, spend money on the fancy things that are supposed to, help us perform every day, when really like the biggest, quote unquote biohacks you can do are like eat well, hydrate adequately, and sleep enough. And I think it's really easy to focus on all the glitz and glamour of like crazy recovery modalities, fancy nutritional products, when like trying to keep it simple and actually like do like the very basic things that are going to be the biggest performance enhancer that, like, compared to anything else.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for that perspective. Much appreciated. And, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today. Hopefully, our viewers have gotten a lot out of this episode. I know I've gotten definitely some things from each of you to take away and think about. I will mention again that these episodes are brought to you by Jackrabbit. And if you are looking for a 25% off discount on your next GU purchase, please use the code FUEL25 on their website and support your local sports retailers. Ladies, thank you. It's been a pleasure. And to the audience, thank you for joining us. We look forward to having you back here next week, same time, same place. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.